Good afternoon. Ninaniha Leah Brady. Na nua naniha akana do wipe. Na Elko Nevada night. Na dosawi nua. Na B Elizabeth Jackson Brady night. Na B dosawi nua. Na uppa Webb Brady. And na uppa dibadika nua. So I just talked to you in my Shoshone language, and technically we don't call ourselves Shoshone, we're Nua. And Nua is, like most tribes, it's the people. And what happened when the explorers came through is they usually had somebody with them that said, "Who are those people over there?" And they would give them a name. So we're really not sure where that Shoshone name came from or which tribe it came from, but we all call ourselves Nua. And the Shoshone go all the way from Death Valley and below, a little below there, all the way up to Wyoming, Montana, where the Eastern Shoshone are. So we're 5 major tribes: the Eastern Shoshone, the Shoshone Bannock, the Northwest Shoshone, the Western Shoshone, and then you have the Panamint Shoshone that are further south. So we're a pretty big tribe, but we're all split up because once we were separated and moved onto reservations and treaties were signed, we were separated. So I've got relatives over here, over there. Everywhere I go, I've got cousins, and it's because our families moved a lot, and we had to travel a lot. And so when we did, we intermarried with a band that was in a different area. And so we have big families. And the story I'm going to tell you about today, I have my card here, is a story that came to us from our great-great-grandfather, and it's an oral history because we learned about our past, our stories, our songs from oral history. And it was usually done during the winter months. So, and it was when everybody was inside their gunnies, which is our houses. And so that's when the storytelling took place. My mother shared this account of her story, and the picture that you're looking at there is Battle Mountain, Nevada. So even though my mother and I were both born here in Elko, her family mostly lived in the Battle Mountain area, Battle Mountain, and then mine also lived in the Owyhee area. So this story tells about our family and their first encounter with the Europeans that came into our area. And we call this area Donomuzo, which is named after the greasewood that's there in that area. There's a lot of really bushes with really sharp thorns if you don't know what greasewood is. I don't think if you live in the West, you don't know what greasewood is. It's not a pleasant bush. And one time, those mountains up there were completely covered with pine trees. But a huge fire wiped out the area and the trees never came back. But that's where my family was at that time. And it was getting near dusk, and they were harvesting the pine nut, which we call dibba. And their father was really distracted because earlier that morning, he suddenly saw this dust cloud down at the river. And if you look at the two pictures, the pictures of mountains there, and then this other mountain picture, you can see a little glimmer of water there. It's an unusual time since if you look at our Humboldt right now, there's hardly any water in it. There's puddles. But from those mountains to the river is a good 20 miles. So he had been watching that cloud of dust, the Huckabee, down on the flats along the Humboldt. He watched it come closer and closer, and he started to fear that it may be a war party, the Ondovich. Ever since they got horses, the northern tribes were able to travel more, and they came down and took horses or took material objects or actually took slaves. So he was starting to worry about the safety of his family. So he finally told his family that it was getting too dangerous to stay and work, and that he needed to go and find out who was coming. And if it was one of their enemies, they needed to leave the area and head south towards the main NUA camps. A large concentration of NUA were in the Austin area, which was about 70 to 90 miles south of where they were at. So he took them and hid them in a small cave in the mountains, and he told them to stay there all day. He told them if he didn't come back that night, that they were to leave the area and go find the Numina in the south. He covered up the opening with rocks and brush, and he left a breathing hole for them. And then he erased all the traces around the cave, and they listened as he ran down the mountainside. The family waited all day, making no sounds. They couldn't hear or see anything, and it was starting to get dark. They stayed even though it got later and later. They didn't want to leave their father, their Appa, without knowing what happened to him. But come dawn, assuming that he had been killed, the family decided that if they didn't leave, they might end up like their father. So saddened and fearing for their lives, they quickly left the area, moving south. And in Nevada, in central Nevada, our mountains run north-south. So as they're traveling all along the mountains, which is important to know because this is a big issue for even the immigrants that came through, is the fact that there was no water sometimes. But in our mountains, we have a lot of springs up there. So that's where they got their water from. So they stayed close to the foothills of the mountains as they were traveling. As they were journeying south, they heard someone coming. And they immediately hid themselves, only to find out that it was their father who had caught up with them. And he was hungry and thirsty, having ran all the way. And after eating, he recounted the confusing scenes that he had seen down at the Humboldt River. He had run all the way down to the Humboldt, and circling around, he came up from the rear to follow these tracks he saw. And as he looked at the tracks, he didn't know what they were because it looked like there was two snakes going in the ground. So he started to follow them. And then he saw their wagons, and he wasn't sure what they were, but they looked like a house, or gunny, on top of these round wooden objects. And then he finally figured out that's what was making the tracks in the dirt. And the closer he got, he recognized the Denyapaz. And Denyapaz is a man in our language. And they were on horses. And he knew what horses were, the bungo, because he had seen them as they were traded by the other bands or tribes. And one of the things that people forget, that we live in a desert here, and there's not much grasslands for animals to graze on. And it's more important that we have deer and antelope grazing than we do have a horse, because they were so used to walking and running everywhere they went. So for us, that horse wasn't important, but the other tribes did use it. So he saw these horses, and then what scared him was that the men that he saw were really pale looking. They were sick, according to him, because they were so pale. And then he had never seen men with a mojo. And a mojo is the hair on a man's face. And so he didn't know who or what these people were, but he knew they were people. And at first, he was real unsure, and then after watching them for the rest of the day and into the night, he knew they were healthy because they were very active. He knew they were hunters because they hunted the beaver, Ani, along the river. But he was astonished by the waste that they made. And they just threw it away except for the hides. They were working on the hides. He saw them kill other animals with a shiny stick that made a thunderous sound. Doyambi Yagi, which is the thunder. He stayed into the evening watching them set up their camp, cook and entertain themselves. He said they cooked their food in a black rock, Dudimbi. And they cooked it over the fire and made strange sounds when they were talking. He couldn't understand them. They also made another sound by rubbing two sticks together. He thought they were singing, Dinatoy, but he couldn't understand them. It sounded more like laughing. And it didn't sound like any singing he had ever heard. He stayed there all night and into the night and until the strangers went to sleep. And then he quietly stole away. He knew his family was already gone, so he ran until he could catch up with them. Scared and confused by what they heard, the family continued south, moving as fast as they could, not knowing this encounter would be the first contact they would have with the strangers, the Daibo, that had come into their lives. When did this occur? Well, we don't know. This was a story that was passed down from grandmother to grandmother, from their grandfather. And at that time, the family was gathering dibba, which was pine nuts. So we knew it was in September, and that season is Yebeni. That's our fall time, and that's when we gather our pine nuts. They would stay in the pine nut hills until the snow fell. They would have to collect thousands of pounds of pine nuts just to survive through the winter. The pine nuts would provide food for them. And of course they had their baskets, the burden basket, the wosa, the winnowing tray, the yando. Those are our baskets we gather, and we also cook in them. They cleaned and cooked the pine nuts using hot embers on a winnowing tray, then ground out the parched nut on stone. And then they would add it to the soups and gravies that they ate most of the summer. They didn't eat a lot of solid foods. They powdered their meats or dried it into jerkies, and they'd do the same with the seeds and the nuts that they gathered. And then they would add them to their soups and gravies. And how do we know it happened? Well, my mother heard this story from her grandmother, her Hootsie, who lived to be 115 years old. And she was born around 1859. And it was passed down from my mother's great-grandmother, Herzo, who was 101 when she passed away. And she was born around 1825. So I come from a really healthy, I guess, in one sense, family, and another, ever since we changed our eating habits, that those ages have gone down. But my father, who lived near Gravelly Ford and grew up in that area, is 94 this year. So I come from a very long-living family. So these stories have been around for a long time. And this is how we learned about our history, our stories. And then in reading the diaries, because I do the newsletter for our California Trail Heritage Alliance, and I read a lot of the diaries, and most of them talk about the fact that they didn't see many Indians. They were there, just like my grandfather was there. They were watching. But the time at which the wagons would reach this area, which was July and August, is the hottest time of the year here. And there's not much food here, because most of the food at that time, we lived a cycle of gathering. That's all we did, is gather and hunt, and that's how we survived living here in the desert. But at that time of the year, July, August, we were up in the Ruby Mountains. We were up there fishing, gathering berries. So we weren't down here in this area. It wasn't until later, when people were here most of the year. But summer is a time for gathering roots also, because you hear that term digger. You're right, we were digging. But what were we digging for? We have potatoes, we have carrots, and all of our medicines are roots, most of them. So those are things that are most important to keep us healthy, and so that's what we were digging for. So this desert out here is our big garden, and that's what we were digging for. And sometimes they wondered why the people on the trains were hungry, and it's because they didn't know around them there was all this food. There was water in the hills, and they couldn't understand why they didn't do some things. It's just like the tour that's going to be on about the Humboldt is north, so let's go south. It's the same kind of thing where the people watched them and they wondered, what are they doing and why are they doing that? And so they never stayed in this area long enough to really know what the plants were in this area. And then, of course, once the wagons started coming through this area and they started seeing more of them, that's when the trouble started, because then the people started retaliating for the damaged foods, the roots, the grasses that were being damaged by that 250,000 people that came through this area. And this area, Elko, the people that lived here were called Basketweaver. So Basketweaver is the people who eat the camas root. And so that was another plant that the livestock liked. And I always describe it as try roasting a potato and opening it and have the butter already there. It is so delicious, but it's also very rich, and you can't eat a lot of it. And there's stories of immigrants who have come through that have eaten something too rich for them and suffered the consequences of eating too much. So we had food here. It just didn't look like it. But once they started retaliating, that's when the killing of the animals started happening, the killing of people started happening, the begging started happening, and then eventually the fighting, which led to soldiers and the treaty. So here in Elko, the main food source or supply, the only time it comes around is when the Humboldt floods. And at this time of the year, you'll never see it flooding. And this encounter changed our lives forever. Because even today as a basket weaver, it's hard for me to find materials to make the baskets, to continue on the culture that we were taught. And we use the baskets for everything from birth. We were put in a basket. Our house was a basket. Our cooking utensils were baskets. And our gathering materials were baskets. Storage was baskets. So for us, the willow is really important. Unfortunately, we have to deal with drought and pesticides and the climate change because our willow is a seasonal plant. So any of those toxic things can cause us damage. So it wasn't just displacement from the territories, but even things such as our clothes. I have on my buckskin skirt today, but not many people tan buckskin anymore, so it's really rare to find. And part of it's because we don't have hunting rights anymore, and it's too hard, and our people have jobs now, and even I tried it once, and it was gross. Because I was working and forgot all about my buckskin. But anyway, these are just a few of the changes, and I'll be here Wednesday and out there with my baskets, and if you have any questions, I think at that time we can answer those. Thank you.